Today we're going to be working with the unit circle in terms of radians. We're going to break up the radians first before we put it on the big circle, and these two down here, starting with the one on the left. And this one on the left we're going to think of as a reference angle of pi over 4. And remember, pi over 4 is equivalent to 45 degrees. So if we take a look at our circle, we can label, if we haven't rotated anywhere, we've rotated 0 degrees. Then if we've rotated 45 degrees, or pi over 4, we're going to be about halfway between 0 and 90, or 0 and pi over 2. So this right here would be pi over 4. All the way up on the top, we would get 2 pi over 4, because we've rotated another 45 degrees. And 2 pi over 4 is the same thing as pi over 2. And if we continue to count, then our next one would be 3 pi over 4. And then 4 pi over 4. And remember, 4 pi over 4 would simplify down to pi. If we continue to count, this would be 5 pi over 4. And then 6 pi over 4. And we can simplify 6 pi over 4 is the same as 3 pi over 2. Then we get 7 pi over 4. And then finally 8 pi over 4, which is the same thing as 2 pi, which is one full rotation. What you should notice is that there is one type of pi over 4 in every quadrant. Okay, so we have 1 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4. These pi over 4s on the top and the bottom, they can be simplified down to a pi over 2. So the ones that we're going to be using are going to be the ones in each of these quadrants. And to figure out that reference angle, well, if you think about 4 pi over 4, you're going one below, so pi over 4 would be the reference angle here to get 3 pi over 4. And if we go one above, again, between 5 pi over 4 and 4 pi over 4 would be that reference angle. So let's put these on the big circle up here on the top. So if we're looking at this big angle, we have right in the middle of the first quadrant, this would be our pi over 4. In the middle of the second quadrant is our 3 pi over 4. In the middle of our third quadrant would be 5 pi over 4. And in the middle of our fourth quadrant would be 7 pi over 4. The other ones that we could list down on here is we could list our pi over 2. So here's 0 or 2 pi if we go all the way around. On the left over here, this is pi over 2. I'm going to have to move down just a little bit. So up here on the top, very top is pi over 2. And if we move down the bottom here, this is 3 pi over 2. Now we're going to take a look at our other triangle, or our other circle, so that we can get the rest of those markings in there. So in this one here we're going to deal with our pi over 3s and our pi over 6s. So we'll do pi over 3s, and I want you to remember that pi over 3 is the same as 60 degrees. And then we'll look at pi over 6, which is the same as 30 degrees. So as we rotate, if this is 0, pi over 6 is 30 degrees, which would be right here. Then if we get to the next part, we would get 2 pi over 6. So this would be 2 pi over 6, but 2 pi over 6 simplifies down to pi over 3. So we get 2 pi over 6, which is the same thing as pi over 3. And then if we continue to count, we would get 3 pi over 6 up here on the top. And 3 pi over 6 is the same thing as pi over 2. If we count some more, we would get 4 pi over 6. And 4 pi over 6, if we simplify it, is the same thing as 2 pi over 3. Keep moving, we get 5 pi over 6. And then we would get 6 pi over 6. And remember, 6 pi over 6 is the same thing as pi. 7 pi over 6. 8 pi over 6, which is the same thing as 4 pi over 3. If we continue, we would get 9 pi over 6 here. And 9 pi over 6 is the same thing as 3 pi over 2. Here would be 10 pi over 6. Well, 10 pi over 6 would simplify down to 5 pi over 3. So that's this one right here. 11 pi over 6. And then 12 pi over 6, which would be all the way around, which is the same as 2 pi. So what I want you to notice here is that in each quadrant, again, so if we look at quadrant number 1, we have a pi over 6 and a pi over 3. We are never going to use pi, like 2 pi over 6, because 2 pi over 6 can always simplify down to pi over 3. So we have a pi over 6, we have a pi over 3. In the second quadrant, we have a pi over 3, we have a pi over 6. In the third quadrant, a pi over 6, a pi over 3. And in the fourth quadrant, a pi over 3 and a pi over 6. Now if we think about it, with 12 pi over 6, right below that is 11 pi over 6. Right above 0 is 1 pi over 6. If we were to keep going after 12 pi over 6, this would be 13 pi over 6. 6 pi over 6, 1 less is 5 pi over 6. 1 more is 7 pi over 6. We can do the same thing with our 3's. So if we look at pi as the same thing as 3 pi over 3, 1 right below it is 2, 1 right above it is 4. So let's go ahead and put these in our unit circle up here on the top so you have a reference of what we're looking at. So in our first quadrant, we have pi over 6, and then we have pi over 3. And then in our second quadrant, we have 2 pi over 3 up here, and we have 5 pi over 6 here. In our third quadrant, we have 7 pi over 6 here. Moving this up, we get 4 pi over 3 right here. And in our fourth quadrant, this is 5 pi over 3 and 11 pi over 6. This is one full rotation in terms of our radians, which can help you, but eventually what we're going to do is we're going to use the right and the left on our x-axis to help guide us what quadrant we're going to be in. Always thinking one below, one above. So let's do that in the examples that follow.